Welcome back, guys. Will Robinson here from Robinson's Auto Tools and Time.com. As you can see, I got a 96 Mitsubishi Eclipse with a bad lower ball joint. I just did the video demonstrating how I went about finding the loose ball joint. You can check that out. I'll put a link in the description. Here's a quick video demonstrating how to replace it. Let's do it to it. This is going to be a complete lower control arm replacement. Okay, as you can see, I already got the vehicle jacked up. I got the jack placed underneath the front cross member, a jack stand placed underneath it for extra safety. So first we're going to start simply by removing the front tire. I usually break the lug nuts loose prior to jacking it, just to make it a little easier. As you can see, it's a strut style suspension. There's a shot of the upper control arm. And when you follow it down, you can see it has a through bolt that goes through the lower control arm. There's the bad lower ball joint. So we'll have to take and remove the through bolt that mounts the strut, that nut on the lower ball joint, and then there's another through bolt right back here where it mounts to that bracket. Alright, the first thing I'm going to do is remove the nut from the lower ball joint. I'm using a 22 millimeter, might be a 7/8. 22 seems to fit it nice. If you can't remove that nut totally, you could just leave it up there until you pop the lower ball joint. Next, I'm going to remove this through bolt that mounts the strut to the lower control arm. I found it to be a 17 millimeter. Should use the wrench on this side. The strut, as you can see, has no pressure on that lower control arm because it's out of travel. Okay, so if you come to the back, you'll see you have the through bolt that goes through the bracket on the subframe. So we're going to take and break that loose for now. That's a 17 millimeter as well. I'm going to take and remove the nut completely. However, I'm going to leave the bolt in place for now. As you can see, it's free inside the bushing, so that's a good sign. Okay, to pop this lower ball joint, I'm going to use the same method as I demonstrated before. I'm going to take and whack the spindle right where the ball joint goes through the spindle. It uses what they call a taper lock style. The shaft on that ball joint actually has a taper on it, and when it goes into the other taper bore, it creates what they call a taper lock. So when you whack it a few times, it'll break it loose and it'll pop. So I'm going to take and whack that with the BFH. Yeah, really get a good swing. There it goes. Okay, as you can see, it popped. So I should be able to just wiggle this out. Okay, now I'll just take and remove this back retaining bolt. I know they don't slide all the way out. They will if you maneuver it, but you don't have to take it all the way out. Alright, there's your lower control arm. Okay, I'm over at the bench. I got the new one here. Just want to do a quick comparison. Since this one's nice and straight, it makes it easy for us. I'll put it center to center on the bushings. They line up perfect. The ball joint looks nice and square. Perfect. And now that I have this off, you could really feel it. That could be a very annoying noise. As you can see, it's an up and down play. The new one's nice and tight. let's install the new control arm. Okay, we're back underneath the vehicle. First I'm going to take and install this back retaining bolt. I'm just going to get everything started. I'm not going to tighten anything down until everything's in place. And I'm going to simply put it up, get the lower ball joint centered. If you see that, keep it down a little bit so you get the nut started. If you push it up and seat it too far in, you won't be able to get the nut started because the axle will be in the way. Okay, now I can reinstall the strut bolt. I'm just going to go and tighten this up right away. Might as well tighten the back one right away. If you get the wrench stuck like that, just double it up. Pull it up a little tighter. And torque it to specs, guys. Like I said, I got a pretty good feel for it. This takes a lock washer behind the nut. So make sure you put everything back together in the same manner as you took it apart. Now all that's left is to simply tighten up the lower ball joint. Okay, so here's a good example. The lower ball joint's spinning because it has a lock style nut. So what I'll do, remember how I said it has a taper shaft on that ball joint that goes up into another taper in the spindle? Okay, these Mitsubishi Eclipses have two lower control arms. I'm only replacing the straight one because that's all that's in the budget. However, I'm going to take and pry on this lower control arm and the subframe. And what I hope that does is pull down on the spindle and pull it in tight to that taper. Let's try it out. Okay, I got the pry bar in. As you can see, it pulled it in tight. Okay, now I'm actually prying on the sway bar and the other control arm. That seems to be working well. I could place a jack underneath the ball joint and jack up on it. However, I'm just using what I got handy. As you can see, this is working fine. Tighten that up nice and tight. Kind of hard to say torque it to specs because you can only get in there with a wrench. But use your best judgment. Get it nice and tight. Okay, we'll start in the back. Got that through bolt tight. Torque down. Got the strut tight. Torque down. And got the lower ball joint nice and tight. through bolt tight, torque down, got the strut tight, torque down. A common mistake that I just demonstrated was tightening these bushings in a fully extended position. Let me take you to the bench and demonstrate something in the vise with the old control arm. Okay, so now here I have the old lower control arm, and the parts I want to focus on are these two bushings. This back bushing went up into the subframe bracket, wrapped around, we put a retaining bolt in, locked it in place. This front bushing, strut came down, went around, put a retaining bolt in, and locked that in place. Well, right there is the most common problem that happens on this style of suspension with these bushings. They tend to get torqued down in a fully extended position. And the problem with that is that these bushings are molded rubber. And that inner collar is molded as one assembly. And then it's pressed into this lower control arm. So this doesn't spin independent. It actually flexes that rubber every time your suspension travels. So hence what we're doing when we lock it in a fully extended position, we're binding that suspension. Let me take you over to the vise and demonstrate. Okay, I'm going to take and lock this upper bushing in the vise. And what this is going to do is simulate us locking this bushing into the upper mounting bracket. So now what you see here is one of the most common mistakes with this style suspension component when replacing it. It's locked in its fully extended position. So now when we let it down off the jack or off the lift, the car is going to settle down to its relaxed position, to its normal stance when it's parked. And now see how it flexed that rubber? It's not in a relaxed position. So now when you hit a bump and your suspension wants to flex, it's going to be binding. It'll travel down nice and free, but when it goes to go up, it's going to be binding. So to correct this from happening is to leave these mounting bolts loose until the car is down on the ground in its normal stance. So this relaxed position will now be in the normal ride height of the vehicle. Lower it down on its wheels and then torque them to specs. That way when you flex the suspension, it'll travel up and down freely. Okay guys, we're back under the vehicle. I got both the retaining bolts loose, as you can see. What I'm going to do is reinstall the tire and lower it down on the ground. And now that we're lowered down on the ground, you're probably asking, how are we going to go about torquing these to specs with these tight ground clearances? Well, to be honest, there's no good way to torque them to spec in these conditions. So what I do is I have a decent impact gun that I'll run these down tight, and it'll get me right around that window. You'll see that there's a pretty decent sized window with the torque specs on these. It might go a little bit beyond. However, a decent impact gun will get those nice and tight to where it won't flex like I showed you in the vise. Alright, now I'll jack it up and check the torque spec. Okay guys, that was pretty straightforward. That's actually the harder of the two control arms to replace, is that straight one, so I figured I'd give you a demonstration. However, I do recommend if you're going to replace it, you might as well replace both of them. But it wasn't in the budget, unfortunately. I did recommend it. But as you can see, it uses the same style ball joint. You just take and remove the top retaining nut, which is a lock nut. And this is actually the easier of the two. Then you come back here on the subframe, and it has two bolts that go up to the subframe. And it's as easy as that. You just remove them two bolts, remove that upper ball joint nut, whack it a few times on the spindle with the BFH like I mentioned, and that'll pop, and then you just remove and replace that assembly. Pretty straightforward. Universal. Makes it a little more challenging when you have all them extra holes. Alright, let's check it out. Much better. I'm going to jack it up, remove it off the jack stand, lower it down, and torque the tire, and we'll be good to go.